Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I see folks trickling in, joining into their audio. We'll let folks in as they come, but we definitely want to get into the conversation. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today, shining a light on ONN's new sector data, using data for advocacy and change. My name is Pamela Upal Sandhu. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Director of Policy as well as the Interim Co-Executive Director here at ONN. I've actually been leading ONN's State of the Sector survey work for the past 3 years, so I sort of bring that to our conversation today. I'd love to know who's in the room with us, virtual room rather, today, so please share your name, your organization, or sort of what brought you to the webinar today, the traditional territories that you're joining from. All of that would be lovely in the chat. If you are new to ONN, welcome. Thanks again for joining. And if you don't know a little bit about us, we're the provincial network for Ontario's 58,000 nonprofits and charities. We focus on public policy, advocacy, and services to strengthen our sector in Ontario as a key pillar of our society and economy. If you already knew about ONN and or you are a member, welcome back and thank you so much for your support. Our public policy work, our research work, our advocacy work, our state of the sector survey work would not be possible without all of you. So thank you. Great. Love all the introductions happening in the chat. Oh, it's so nice to see so many familiar folks. Some quick FAQ before we sort of get into it. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, you can type the issue out in the chat box, and our team who's online, Katie and Vish will be able to help you with that as soon as possible. And the most common question, this webinar is going to be recorded, so you'll receive an email with the slides and the resources in the next 2 weeks. Thank you. And so circling back to sort of sharing the territories that we're calling in from today, I do want to start by grounding our webinar. I want to begin with, of course, acknowledging that we're meeting on unceded and unsurrendered land that has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples from time immemorial. As you can probably notice, I'm in ONN's office today, which is at Yonge and St. Clair, and that's the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We share this space and we call it Foundation House, and we have a sort of a collective land acknowledgement that we like to share with the sector as well, and really emphasizing that our territory is part of the Upper Canada Treaties, and at ONN, we really believe that as nonprofits, we need to take seriously our recommendations, the calls to actions for Truth and Reconciliations commissions, and really sort of weave them into all the different works that we do. And our State of the Sector survey, one of the ways that we've been trying to do our part in the Truth and Reconciliation work is disaggregating the data. And so for the last 4 years, we've been asking organizations to self-identify as either Indigenous-led, Indigenous serving, Indigenous focus, an Indigenous partnership, or all of the above, and disaggregating that data. And we did sort of a deep analysis and share that back out with our Indigenous-led organizations. So sort of bringing that to the conversation today as well. Amazing to see all the folks in the room. So getting into our State of the Sector survey, first and foremost, there's a beautiful QR code there. Please click on that or scan that and use that. It'll redirect you to all the different resources that we have. I want to spend just a little bit of time sharing our origin story of the survey, because I'm not sure if a lot of people know. They just know that we do it every year. So we started doing this survey in 2020, and the impetus was so simple. It was the beginning of the pandemic, 2 weeks in, actually, and all the stuff was happening around us, to our organizations, to the people we were serving, to our workers who are part of the communities that we serve. And we had no idea what that impact was on our sector collectively at an aggregate level, but also from a disaggregated, disproportionate impact as well. At the same time, you probably remember federal, provincial, municipal governments and our philanthropic partners were rolling out supports and programs and all of those things quickly as well. And we needed to know if nonprofits were eligible, if nonprofits were accessing, if nonprofits, if those supports were working, and what were some unintended consequences. So we started this survey back in 2020, 2 weeks into the pandemic. At the height of that survey, we had 3,000 organizations across the province respond. And it really was filling that data gap. There was no other data set or survey that could provide us a snapshot on the state of the sector in a given moment of time. And so we did another survey 2 months into the pandemic because of the success of the first one in June of 2020. And that is what kickstarted our cadence of doing it every year. And again, that it was to fill that data gap and to provide that state of the sector, that snapshot. And the other piece that was really important was for us to give that data back to the sector. We know how important data is. We know how important doing evidence-based policy work or advocacy work or programming work, depending on where you are in the sector, is. And so our way of being reciprocal and living our value of reciprocity was not to safeguard that data, but to put it back out there so people can use it and use it on all the different and various ways that is helpful for them. And so since then, we've been doing it every single year. And every single year, we ask organizations to fill out our core questions that have stayed consistent over the past 5 surveys. And then we pepper in some new emerging themes or ideas that are connected to our policy priorities, our policy agenda, or just things that we're hearing from the sector that is very important for us to capture. Often folks, I think in the virtual room and in our network, like to say our survey's like a lighthouse, which is why we have a lighthouse on the front page of our survey today, because it not just shines a light on what's happening right in front of us in the present moment, but it also sort of lets us see what's on the horizon, what's upcoming. And so, if you think of the last 5 years, our survey has really followed the sector through multiple crises. The height of the pandemic, both sort of the successes of pushing money out really quickly during the pandemic, but also the fallout from the pandemic. It's followed our sector through the affordability crisis and peak inflation. We were able to sort of see how that was impacting us. We were also able to see, when all the COVID-19 supports and services and programs shuttered and sort of this new post-pandemic reality, what that meant for our sector. And more recent, and also the HR crisis, that's something that we were able to track over the last 3 to 4 years, and the volunteer crisis. And then more recently, this survey in 2025 starts to see that beginning point of the economic uncertainty and how that's impacting our sector. If you filled out the survey this year or previous years, thank you so much. We know it's long, we know it can be tedious, and we know it can be hard at times, but that information and that data is so, so helpful. It really gives us insight into what's happening in the sector, and it allows us to share that back out with many, many different parts in our ecosystem. And it also gives the rest of the sector to use something to give quantitative numbers to the qualitative realities that they have on the ground when they're talking to their funders, their boards, their communities, their workers, and the people that they're serving. So thank you again. And maybe the last thing I'll sort of mention about the resources, there's so many there, so just wanted to pinpoint what each one is. So the public policy report with the Lighthouse is the one where we have our own analysis. We've gone through and picked out key findings, key themes. That'll give you a snapshot of 2025 data, how it compares to 2024 data, and then it gives you our 5 long-term trends that we've been tracking for the past 5 years, and it ends with public policy recommendations, calls to action for the sector, and calls to action to the public. The Environics Research Technical Report, that's bilingual as well. Our State of the Sector report is bilingual too, but that Environics research does a really nice deep dive into the methodology of our survey, as well as the 2025 data. So it really goes through how everyone answered all the questions. And then the data set, so we have a big Excel sheet that has data from each year that you can compare year over year and disaggregate it to the best of our abilities. And then for the last 2 years, we have data tables that are a little bit more research friendly for folks to use as well. And just sort of now pivoting to giving you some really broad highlights of the state of the sector in 2025 and then how that compares to 2024. To be quite honest, when our team jumped into the data, we do collective analysis first. Not much had changed. The headline stories around demand increasing year over year, that was the same, demand was the same as last year. The capacity to meet that demand, that had not shifted from last year. So to give you a sense, 85% of respondents this year said that they had seen an increase in demand for their programs and services, but only 20% can fully meet demand, and those numbers did not shift from last year. We also track revenues, and again, this year, revenues remained stagnant and declining for the sector. 54% reported that their revenues were remaining stagnant or declining, and that did not change from last year. Expenses continue to be high. They're not the highest that we've seen them in the last 5 years, but 83% still continue to report that their expenses increased, and that just changed 1 percentage point from last year. And we started tracking organizations that are at high risk of not existing in the next 3 years, and that number was 10% last year, and it continued to be 10% this year. On the flip side, we had just some quick notable changes that I think are important for us to think about. One was reserve fund usage. That climbed back up to levels that we haven't seen since 2020. So it's doing that nice little U on a graph. 34% of our respondents this year said that they dipped into their reserve funds. That was an increase of 3 percentage points. While the 10% risk piece hasn't changed, the low risk piece has changed. So low risk is anywhere from 1 to 3 of not existing in the next 3 years. That increased by 5 percentage points, and that's about 57% of our respondents reporting that. The one stat that I found the most interesting, because we've been tracking this for the past 4 years, is the HR recruitment or retention. So we ask, are you experiencing challenges in recruiting and retaining people? And for the last 3 years, that number has not shifted. It's been hovered between 63, 64%. This year it went down. It went down about 11 percentage points. Still pretty high, still half the sector, 52% saying they can't recruit or retain folks, but a decrease from last year, and something definitely that we dig in our policy report. And then the last notable change is we measure the impact of the HR and volunteer crisis on programs and services. So we ask nonprofits to tell us if they're scaling back, if they're shutting down, or if they're seeing increased waitlists for their programs and services. And all of those numbers spiked this year again. So about 62% are reporting scale backs. That's up 6 percentage points. 47% saw an increase in waitlists. That's up 14 percentage points. And 17% are reporting shutdowns of their programs and services, and that's up 5 percentage points. So lots there to dig into. I'm not going to go over sort of some of the other big pieces. I really encourage you to read our report, or if you or your network would love a presentation that does a bit of a deep dive, please reach out to us. We're happy to support that as well. But what I want to jump into next is the conversation that we really wanted to steward today. One of the things that our team has been thinking so deeply about is the value of the data and the value of the State of the Sector survey. And so we wanted to bring 3 people on that we've had some really great conversations about how they're using the data, how the data has been helpful and valuable in pushing forward some of the priorities that they have. And we thought that was a really great way to model that for the rest of the sector. And so if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. You can put them into the chat as well. We'll have time to get into it. Other than that, we have a bunch of questions, and we're going to sort of jump right in. So if we can get our panelists back on our screen. Amazing. Hi, Jillian. Hello, Miriam. And there's Jawad. So I've had the privilege of chatting with all of 3 of these panelists and talking about our State of the Sector survey, and we're really excited to have them here today. Welcome. Why don't we just do a quick round of introductions? So please tell us who you are, where you're coming from, and sort of your entry point into the survey. And maybe I'll start with Jawad.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, ONN, for inviting me to be part of the panel. I'm coming to you from France, actually, this evening, so I hope that you can hear me clearly. I am a refugee and immigration lawyer by background. I spent about 20 years with Legal Aid Ontario as an executive working in refugee and immigration law. I began volunteering for different boards, and most recently I was the chair of Fred Victor, chair of the board of Fred Victor. Fred Victor is an organization in Toronto that supports persons who are homeless. And through that whole process of being on the board, I realized that there wasn't an organization or a group that focused on board advocacy. And so I thought, and together with the folks at Fred Victor, the idea was to create a coalition of board directors. And the coalition, we called it the Shelter and Support Board Advocacy Coalition. So it's a coalition of board volunteer representatives of different shelter and support community operated organizations in Toronto. So we have Fred Victor, we have the YWCA, we have Dixon Hall, we have a number of other shelter and support organizations. And our focus really has been around advocacy and advocating for change in the sector, particularly around wage equity. I don't know, Pam, whether you want to get into a bit more detail around that, or that's sufficient for the introduction.
Yeah, let's hold on to that. Let's hear from them,
Sure,
and I'll circle back. Thank
sure.
you.
Thank you.
Why don't we go to Miriam next?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Really, thanks so much for inviting me to participate in this panel. My name is Miriam Kramer. I use she, her pronouns. I am calling in from Tkaronto, the traditional territories of the Mississauga of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat, among others. I am currently the Executive Director of Government Relations and Public Policy at OCAD University. So for those unfamiliar, we're Ontario's only and Canada's top art, design, and media university. And we'll be celebrating our 150th anniversary next year. So lots to celebrate. At the university, I lead government and community relations work. And I also oversee the Cultural Policy Hub. So that's a bilingual national network of policymakers, researchers, and practitioners from all across the country dedicated to interpreting and improving the accessibility of cultural policy discussions, design, development, and capacity building. We focus both on the not-for-profit side of the arts and culture, as well as on the creative industries like film, television, animation, and gaming. We produce research, we convene people, we write policy, we give advice to government and organizations. In that work, we focus on 3 areas: precarity, technological disruption, and democracy. I'll put a link to our website in the chat. I'm also involved in the not-for-profit world more generally as the vice chair of the STEPS Board of Directors. STEPS is a Canadian charity and a social enterprise that offers services in public art management, hoarding exhibits, cultural planning, and artist capacity building. I have a data background. I used to work in a data shop. So I am so excited to be part of this conversation and talk about how we've been collaborating with the ONN on data, and really looking forward to this. Thank you.
Thanks, Miriam. And Jillian.
I'm Jillian White. I'm the Director of Measurement, Evaluation, and Business Intelligence at the Ontario Trillium Foundation. I think most people are familiar with OTF, but we are an agency of the provincial government that grants money to the nonprofit sector. My connection to this survey goes back right to the beginning. So I started in my role at OTF in October 2019, really in both our sort of like impact measurement as well as sort of the internal research entity within OTF. And March 2020, everybody was giving me a call asking what we should do. So my team was busy looking for resources and really coming up empty-handed. And in lieu of doing our own survey, our partnerships team kind of put my team in touch with ONN, and we worked together to create that first State of the Sector survey, really looking at the core pieces of financial and operations that we've been using extensively since 2020. So it's a really valuable resource for us, and I'm really happy to be here.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone, for that lovely introduction. I always find folks introducing yourselves is so much better than someone introducing yourself. So thank you for that. And so let's jump into our first question, and we'll sort of do the same like Jawad, Miriam, and Jillian. So share with us an example of how you've used State of the Sector survey data and why you find this State of the Sector survey data important.
So it really all started back in 2023 when we created the coalition that was consisted of board directors from various shelter and support organizations. Um, when we began talking about wage equity and the impact of low wages on employees, frontline staff, and managers in the shelter and support sector, it was clear that we didn't have enough data to go to advocate in an evidence-based way. And so I had connected with Pamela at ONN, and we had a few conversations about it. And Pamela came to one of the SSBAC meetings, so Shelter and Support Board Advocacy Coalition meetings, and then we talked a little bit about whether it would be possible to get some data that spoke to the retention and recruitment issues that were being experienced in the shelter and support sector, particularly the community operated shelter and support sector organizations. And as a result, Pamela was able to add a couple of questions in the 2024 survey to collect data that assisted us, first of all, in identifying the overall trend in the sector with regard to recruitment and retention and all the challenges that were being experienced, broadly speaking. And then with this data, we were able to represent before some city councilors and before the staffers, city staffers at City Hall in Toronto, to emphasize the importance of wage equity and to demonstrate that we had actually done some of our homework, and that we had data, concrete data that showed that the wage issues and wage and benefits issues were having an impact on retention and recruitment, and conversely, as you can imagine, having impact on service delivery. Obviously, the City of Toronto is very, very interested in ensuring that shelters and the support sector is well funded, delivering quality service. And so we have been able to make a bit of progress in better wages for our frontline staff, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the next question. But just to say that without the data and without evidence, the argument was really very weak. And anecdotally, of course, there are lots of stories about how difficult things are for staff, and how organizations are suffering with recruitment and retention issues and having to hire temp workers and so on. But with the data, it really assisted us in moving this issue forward, and at a sector level. So it wasn't simply on a shelter by shelter level, but on a sector transformational level. I think we've had some impact. So that is really one of the key ways that I found the data has been helpful. If I could just also add that what was also very important to us was emphasizing the decent work strategy and using some of the information that Pamela and ONN had developed around racialization and poverty and care. As you know, many care workers are gender-based, it's a female gender, and often very racialized. And this was also a very important piece of data and information for us to use as we advocated around inequity and the staffing of shelters.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And I put a link in the chat to some of the coalition work online, and I'm sure Jawad would be happy to talk to anybody who would be interested in learning more. And just quickly wanted to underscore, we had an idea that wage parity was a thing in our sector, but like Jawad said, it was very qualitative and anecdotal. And so it was so important for us to hear from the sector, no, like you need to measure this. There's something happening here. And so we were able to quickly, and because we do it annually, put that in our survey. Now we have about 3 to 4 years worth of like HR recruitment and retention challenge data. But we also started asking what are the top factors, and wage disparity kept showing up as the top 3. And that's so important to share over time. And I think, based on our Jawad and I's conversation, that was the impetus for us to add the question around the impact on programs and services, if they're shutting down, scaling back, or if we're seeing increased wait lists. So all to say, like having these conversations with the sector on an ongoing basis is so important in the way in which we craft the survey and the type of questions we ask and the data that we give back. Yeah, okay, so Miriam, I'll pass it to you next.
Yes, and I just want to reiterate something that Jawad, well, Pam, you summed it up really well around the importance of the data, but Jawad specifically talked about without the data and evidence, the argument is very weak. And I feel like that is a key message of today. It's a key message of my life that I've been trying to employ in the advocacy work that I've been doing for more than a couple decades. And I'm so glad that we're having this conversation. So how did the Cultural Policy Hub and Oak Head University use the data? I talked earlier about the work that we do, and specifically with a focus on precarity. The sector survey data helped our research team at the Cultural Policy Hub augment and verify data for a multi-year research project that we're doing on precarity and resilience in the not-for-profit arts and culture sectors. So over the past couple of years, we've had funding from the Department of Canadian Heritage to do a research project that's in multiple parts. I'll put one of the reports, although pay attention to me, don't go read it, do that later. But we've been looking at precarity in the sector using various different data sets. It's called Mapping Drivers of Change Across Arts Organizations. And it kind of tries to look at a during the pandemic and post-pandemic picture of arts and culture not-for-profits across the country, and with a view to help arts and culture leaders address precarity and resilience in the sector. And so the two primary objectives of this work is cultivating organizational leadership competencies, and them being able to for example, them being able to identify and understand how to use data, and also helping them with research, case studies, and tools like that evidence base that we talked about for ways that they can apply to their organizations with a view for sustainability and resilience. So as part of this research, we did, all the usual things, a lit review of stats insights. We conducted interviews, and then we did a data dive using the Canadian Arts Database, which is also known as CADAC. And that is a database that the Canada Council of the Arts holds that has financial information of about 1,800 not-for-profits arts organizations from the 2013 to 2023. But because, as I said, we were trying to get a good picture pre-pandemic, pandemic, and post-pandemic, the quantitative data that we were looking at only went until 2023. And this research was taking place in 2025. So this is where we turned to ONN. We heard that they had more recent data. The team was immensely helpful. They helped us gather and deliver and code their initial data, segmenting out the arts, culture, and heritage tourism organizations from the rest of the sector. And that allowed us to both verify, as I said, and augment, and let us see a fuller picture. And we talked earlier about the importance of kind of having year-to-year comparisons, but also long-term trends. So this was on a micro level for the particular research that we were doing. It was super helpful, but it also just the ongoing nature of these data being collected province-wide for not-for-profits in a bigger way that's not just arts and culture is also so helpful for future work and really being able to understand what is going on from a trend perspective. And I just want to shout out to the team that really helped gather and deliver that data, helped us understand it. There was such a strong commitment that was really, really collaborative and wonderful to work with.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. And just also underscoring what Miriam is saying around the verifying and the augmenting, right? I think there is so much data out there, right? There's no question about that. But that piece around it being sector driven, or what do we want to know as a sector? We're asking that, we're gathering that information, and then we're interpreting and analyzing that ourselves as well and putting that narrative out versus it being sort of a third party and done to us. I think that's been my big learning, particularly this year. And I think that really sort of maps onto Miriam, kind of what you're saying as well, right? Yeah, okay. And Jillian.
So this is the 6th year of the survey, and I think the way that we at OTF have used the survey has sort of evolved since the beginning. So in the early days, I think everyone was really scrounging for like what's going on in the sector and then using that to like pivot, the next week. So for us, for our funding, the impacts and challenges around, I think we asked a specific question around COVID impacts and operational challenges. And that was really helpful for informing like literally what the things were that we were funding in our Resilient Communities Fund. Since then, I would say the really big pieces are for our board and leadership learning. So our board is government appointed. They may or may not have a really good understanding of the nonprofit sector. So it is really important for helping them sort of get up to speed and oriented around the nonprofit sector and the issues facing the nonprofit sector. We also use it. The timing of this survey is honestly so fortunate for me when I help write the business plan and when I help inform our senior leadership team's discussions around the business plan, because the timing is such that this survey gets released. I read it basically the day it comes out, and then I pull the key pieces into sort of an executive summary and pass that over to our senior leadership team. So it's enormously helpful for that. And then just the context and sort of one-off questions that I get regularly, everything from, I think a board member was interested to know how the tariffs were affecting the nonprofit sector. And I could go into the data tables and I could look up, how different the whole sector and then different subsectors within the nonprofit sector had responded to that question in the survey and give, like an answer 10 minutes later that's super well informed. I usually go check a couple other sources to just see if they're saying the same thing. So went and checked the Charity Insights Canada project, looked to see that actually both were saying the same thing. It's more just sort of the broader economic issues, more so than the US tariffs. But so I guess that in that way, it helps me look very informed. And then we've also used it, our partnerships team has a little bit more flexibility in the types of things that they pursue, and those are in partnership with, other, I don't know, agents within the nonprofit sector looking to support communities, but through like a sustainable and healthy nonprofit sector. So an example there was Jawad talked about the HR crisis, but alongside that is the volunteer crisis. So that informed some of I think the development of a national volunteer strategy. Those are like, I'm sure there's like a number of other ways that I use it and that OTF uses it, but those are the ones that really I think come to mind.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And yes, totally want to acknowledge sort of Jillian's been in the trenches with us at times. We're trying to build a dashboard. We're trying to, try various different things and showcasing the data and are super support, like thankful for that support. And so it's like a good segue into our next question, because one of the things that we really wanted to do for the audience was show you like the data in action and hope that inspires you in some way to use the data for your own organizational or collective or sector or network systems transformation work or advocacy, all of that. And so my next question sort of, ties nicely. It really is, what was the outcome of like how you use the data? You shared a bunch of different examples and sort of started touching on that too. What were some successes in using the state of the sector survey data, but also challenges? I mean, we're pretty transparent. There are limitations to the data that we have, right? And so, yeah, would love to hear from you, and maybe we'll follow the same order again. So maybe Jawad, let's start with you.
Sure. Thank you. So I think with the wage equity issue, just to frame it up a little bit, the challenge really in the sector in Toronto with shelter and support organizations was the disparity between wages being paid by city-operated shelters and community-operated shelters. And the city-operated shelters, their staff were paid 20 to 30% more than community-operated shelter staff. And so obviously there is, in my view, an injustice here. And if you're doing the same work, you should be paid the same amount. So we began presenting data, some from the ONN survey, and began conversations with, first of all, with the staff at City Hall responsible for shelters and support services. And then we began advocating with councillors at the City of Toronto, making the case for this inequity and also raising the issues around, gender, race, and the caring sector. So I'm happy to report that there has been some movement, and that community operated shelter staff now are being paid a bit more than they were when we started. And so we are seeing some progress. It's not as much as the Shelter and Support Board Advocacy Coalition would like to see. And we are continuing to advocate for equity and wage parity, if you like, between the community operated shelter staff and the city operated shelter staff. As you can imagine, the recruitment and retention issues are all often related to that very fact. Would you work for a community operated shelter that pays you 30% less, or will you go to a city operated shelter and work for them and get paid a higher salary? So we are moving. The data has been extremely helpful. The outcome is we are in progress. It's shifting. There's greater awareness, and there's some movement to change the structural inequity that we've seen in the shelter sector.
Thanks for sharing that, and really how the data is also almost like little seedlings that you put in front of like government in this case to be like, oh, hey, here's some like information about the problem that we're trying to solve together collectively and the impact. Yeah. Miriam, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, I mean, our process is still evolving in really what the outcomes are. I mean, in terms of outputs, we published 2 reports, in the spring and the summer, qualitative and quantitative. The work is still outgoing, but what's been really interesting to watch is the public and community engagement with the work. And I don't know if folks are following the Cultural Policy Hub on LinkedIn, you'll see that we did kind of a little we did a bunch of vignettes around kind of the key data points with some data charts that around these data, mostly the CADAC data, but augmented by the ONN data. And there's been a lot of attention to it. Folks are hungry for the data. I think that there is this excitement around the fact that these data exist. There's multiple sources that have it. They can talk to each other, although one of the challenges that I want to mention is that, they don't also always talk to each other, and there's little apples to oranges going on, and there's also just some inconsistencies too, which are interesting. But I think that the fact that there's a hunger for the data and a desire for this is quite exciting. In terms of next steps, we're kind of leveraging this work that we've done to try to create an index of sorts that can kind of look at a precarity from multiple dimensions. So thinking around it, not just in terms of organizational, financial revenue, but and spending, but also ready, what the workforce looks like, what its governance looks like, how ready is it to transform with new technologies like AI. And so it's helping us provide a background for that. So I would say that the conversation is ongoing. And we're also trying to roll out some supports for organizations to help them. And I do this wearing also the VET board vice chair hat for the not-for-profit board that I sit on, in terms of how can we support executive directors, boards to be able to understand, use the data, help understand their own data in the context of the larger not-for-profit sector, and helping themselves be more resilient for the future. So I would say it's been really helpful. The hunger for it has been really refreshing and amazing. And then the work is still ongoing in terms of how we continue to use it and leverage the evidence to buoy and support organizations who will continue as the data from this new report shows that we're still in kind of a precarious, uncertain time across the board.
Yeah, I love, I want to pick up on that piece around like data talking to each other, right? Because as Jillian also shared, we put together the survey because this type of information didn't exist. And over time, of course, there's Stats Canada data, there's the business conditions survey that talks about nonprofits, but they capture a segment. There's the Charity Insights Project through Carleton, which I think Kate is probably in the virtual room, that focus on charities, right? So if you're not a nonprofit, if you're a nonprofit but not a registered charity, you might not be in that, but they have such a great panel that is super representative, right? And we're not the only province that does state of the sector survey. So like coincidentally, or BC just came out with their report a week before we did. Nova Scotia came out with their report 2 weeks after us. And we've been trying really hard to coordinate at that level, ask the same questions, and same with the CICP, right? So some of the questions that we asked this year were actually borrowed from their survey as well. But I take, like, that is a limitation for us at some points, right? Because we're trying to take a scoop of the soup that's a little bit different than all these other sources, because that's kind of the focus, or that's the missing piece in the other data, right? But then you're right, you run into that sort of problem around like, okay, this is one part of the soup, this is another part of the soup, and there's a bit of overlap, right?
Yeah, and some inconsistency too, but I think that's okay, and that's just part of the picture, and that is also then how we are in conversation with each other and other parts of the sectors and other sectors to just try to figure out really what's going on. So I think that's part of it, which is makes it more interesting and collaborative.
Yeah, and I really like that take on it. Like, we don't need one thing to be it all, right? And how do we use different parts, different focus areas, different data sets, and make them talk to each other and paint this really nuanced, complex picture of the sector, right? Yeah. Okay, Jillian, I'll pass it to you. I know you started sharing some examples too, but yeah.
Yeah, I think I've already spoken to a couple of the outcomes of how we had used the data in terms of like informing our grant objectives. I would say one of the other outcomes is how frequently ONN's State of the Sector survey is cited in our business plan and the environmental scan, among other important resources. But it really is an ongoing resource. It's not so much like one outcome as it is a consistently turn to, and it really is sort of like my back pocket resource. There are a few of them that I really turn to, but I think when it comes to challenges, obviously, like you're saying, like not everything can go into the survey, or you start to sort of like get a bit of mission creep. And then for OTF, I think one of the challenges is we sometimes learn something really important, but there's a lot of things that influence how we fund and what we fund, and those things are not necessarily flexible. So like our MOU with the government and mandate letters, there are things that we absolutely have to stick to. So we might learn something really interesting about a need in the sector or a need in communities, and we can't always act on it. And that's just something that I think it's still really important for context to know that need or that issue is out there. It might be something that we share with our government funder, so that they are aware, but it just might not be sort of within our purview to be able to take any sort of action on. So I would say that is that's one of our challenges. And yeah, I think that's all.
Yeah, and that's like something we fall into as well. Our team wants to ask way more questions and collect data than is possible for us to even dissect, right? Jawad, I saw you unmuted. Did you want to jump in?
No, I'm just fine. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, it's like there's so much to know. And so part of our like internal work has been for every question we add on, that's like another 5 minutes for the person filling it out, right? And so in this like capacity stretched thin sort of environment and climate, and wanting our survey response rate to remain credible, how do we really parse out what we're asking and when we're asking? And sometimes surprisingly enough, sometimes we'll put a question out there and then the findings aren't that interesting when we look at it. We're like, oh, okay, like that's, it is what it is kind of thing. And so there is a lot of like mindfulness to crafting the perfect questionnaire and survey. And then, yeah, like to your point, like not being able to use all the data all the time. We're trying to get better at like the cadence of questions. If we've asked it in like, let's say year 2, maybe we don't need to ask for another couple years, right? Because what's going to really be the change year over year. But those core questions around finance and operations and demand and HR and volunteerism, those we have to keep asking every year. We actually had a moment in 2023 where we're like, you know what, we're just going to stop doing the survey because it's a lot of work internally and externally, and the response rate is not keeping up, and like maybe we just, this is like a signal for us to not do it. And we had some really great conversations with a couple of our partners, and the 2 learnings were, one, everyone's getting, like, everybody already knows when you have to fill it out, right? So why would you break that, or why would you fall into a different cadence? And that's true. Like this past year we got emails like 2 months in advance, like, when's your survey coming out, we want to fill it out. So that's been really helpful. And then the second piece, which really is what came from you and Jillian, you were chatting, was the moment you stop collecting data is the moment things will probably change, and then you'll never know when they changed, why they changed, how they changed. And so we've also fallen into this sort of space where we're like, it's okay if we don't do all the things with the data. At least we have it documented. At least we have it down on paper that this was the state of the sector in this moment, or we've documented things didn't change or things changed, and this is why we think things might have changed in this moment, right? And so that brings me to our sort of last question together, and then we can take some questions. I see a couple have popped up in the Q&A, but please put them in as much as possible, and we'll sort of get to them. And then the last question is really about opportunity, right? I feel like year over year, we kind of are saying the same thing, right? Big picture, that the needs are great, demand is going up, our resources to deliver on that demand are declining, and they're really being shaped by these external social, political, economic factors. And we don't have nearly enough the people that we need to fulfill that capacity to meet our missions, whether that's from a volunteer perspective or paid workforce perspective. And so with this context in mind, and maybe, all of your hats on and not necessarily one hat, where do you see an opportunity to move the needle on the sector and on the different issues the sector's facing with this data? Like, is there something you're like, oh, this would be really cool to focus on, or what if we did this collectively? Any big ideas are more than welcomed. Yeah, maybe I'll switch the order around because I feel like we've been putting Jawad on the spot every question. So maybe Miriam, I see you've unmuted. Do you want to go first?
Yeah. And when I hear this question, I hear it kind of in 2 parts, around one on organizations and their own future and sustainability, but also around data. And I want to pick up on the data piece, if I can talk on that first. Like, I want to pick up on some of the things that you were saying earlier, Pam, around just inability to even have the human resources to like sift through it all to understand it. And that's where the partnerships come in. So whether it's with the Cultural Policy Hub, I see Kate Cornell is on here. I don't remember, I saw a couple colleges earlier. So post-secondary institutions are great partners. We've got people that, whether it's through something like our research center or other, a class where you've got people who can help sift through this and help mobilize the data and understand it. That is something that we would love, OCADU and the Cultural Policy Hub would love to partner on more. I think, you did a lot of sharing of your data. Maybe we need to do a bit more sharing of the data that we have. I'd love for us, again, arts and culture specific, but these exist for not-for-profit and other sectors too, like these research data centers that can hold these data. They hold mostly StatsCan and government data, but wouldn't it be amazing if we could hold data that are collected in the not-for-profit sector also, and it can be open and available for people in a safe and researchly ethical way for people to be able to use it, so that we can generate more research out of the data and more points of evidence to help us in our advocacy and our storytelling about what's happening and our understanding really of what's happening across these sectors here in Canada. Obviously, on the precarity of organizations, it's a bit of a tougher question. As I said earlier, we are prototyping in a toolkit or an index that kind of look at organizations' precarity, and not just from a financial perspective, right? There's workforce, and the survey gets at some of these things: governance, physical space. And we're looking for people to test it with. So we're going to be talking with, with the Canada Council, with the Calgary Arts Development Authority. Happy to discuss it with an Ontario audience, and maybe the ONN is our partner here to reach out to some of the folks that participated from arts and culture. And I think while right now it's designed, because that's our area of expertise is arts and culture, I think it could be the framework for it could very easily be adopted to other not-for-profits because it's pretty general. So I would love to have a chat with ONN, with Trillium, with Jawed, and the kind of group of organizations that you work with, and folks that are on the call to think around how we can use this tool that builds on the data as a way to help us. Again, it's not really an advocacy tool. It's really just helping us understand more about what's happening within our organizations, and once we understand the problem, or a more nuanced problem, then we can work together toward solutions, and whether that's government or other solutions together.
I love that invitation. Thank you. And
Right.
Jillian, how about you?
My thinking on this is, I think, a little bit broader, which is that data in good times is as important as data in bad times. And like, imagine the medical field without diagnostic criteria from healthy people. We wouldn't know how to make sense of, blood work that's taken from somebody who is sick. So the fact that we started this when we were like in the depths of a pandemic, and we really don't have a baseline, I think, to me, is like where we move the needle is in our data practices. The old adage, like, what gets measured gets managed. I think it's really about visibility for the nonprofit sector, and the tool to continue to sort of like stay a part of the story for, governments at all levels as well as the public. How do you do that if you don't have data to use? So whether it is for, like something specific, like workforce precarity and inequities, or something more broadly, if we don't have any data to even like paint a picture of what normal times look like for the nonprofit sector, how do we even describe ourselves and like stay visible and relevant without that? So I don't know how that answers your question about moving the needle. But it's something that I've been thinking about a lot, with especially those questions that you asked in the policy report. They were very thought-provoking for me.
I love that. I'm stealing that. Data in good times is just as important as data in the bad times, or the flip, sorry. But yes, I love that. Jawad, I'll pass it to you for sort of the last.
Sure. Just briefly, I guess there are two things I wanted to say. One was, we will go back to the city hall and the councillors and say, listen, the data is proving that you are making a difference. So our advocacy has made a difference, but I know that City Hall wants to do good. And so we can demonstrate that by saying, we advocated for this, you heard us, you responded, and things are improving. Recruitment and retention, and very, very slow way, is improving. I think that's very, very valuable and very worthwhile doing. And then the second thing really is around advocacy and wanting to really understand why there is not more advocacy going on, why more boards of different organizations are not stepping up to advocate for change in the sector, using data to advocate for change. So I don't know. So I guess I would just leave it at that. It's, we're fortunate to have this group of shelter and support sector boards that have come together and said, we want to advocate for this sector. And they're volunteers, and they're the community voice, and so on and so forth. But I don't think there's a lot of that happening within the different sectors. And so it'd be interesting to understand why. And I know you have some questions, Pamela, around advocacy, and it's a board governance thing, I think, at the end of the day, but it can have an impact.
Oh, I love that too. I love the piece around like sharing the good news that's coming out of the data. We focus a lot on like what's not going well. But you're right, in the numbers shifted around the HR, and wage disparity wasn't necessarily the number one factor for the first time in 3-4 years, right? Not to say it's the same across the board, but we do know Toronto has a big sample size in our survey. And one of the like hypotheses we put in the report was maybe some of the advocacy work that folks are doing is working, right? Maybe some of the strategies that folks are trying to implement to recruit and retain people are working. So I love that point. And yes, there's a lot of advocacy related questions in the survey. And so we're going to have a brief actually coming out on digging deep into the advocacy piece in the new year. So watch out for that. Okay, we got a bunch of questions and we have 5 minutes, so let's see if we can get through all of them. So the first one is from Shelley. Do you have data about nonprofits' views about Gen AI and adoption levels? So we don't. We asked sort of similar questions about 2 years ago, so we're waiting to ask them again. But CICP, which is the Charity Insights Canada project, they do weekly pulse surveys. And Kate, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a technological adoption survey that went out, I think, in the past 1 or 2 months. And so there's more real-time, like up-to-date data on that front. And I'm sure someone in the chat will share that.
Yeah, and I also add Ontario Works is in the process of collecting a survey on exactly the Gen AI adoption levels and also just thoughts and feelings around that. So I think early 2026, the data are being collected now. So that will be another kind of piece of data that can tell some of that story.
Awesome. Yeah. And then we might think about pulling those questions in sooner rather than later. And so while I have you, Miriam, there's a specific question for you. Can you share more about your resource tool, what it is, where they can find it?
Reach out. I'll put my email and reach out to me. It's not publicly available. It's still really in like early beta prototype, but I'll put my email in the chat and you can reach out and then we can be in touch around that. And also just follow us on, I don't want to sound like a commercial, but follow us on LinkedIn. And that's mostly where we put out most, so you can know exactly what's happening with the Cultural Policy Hub. And so there'll be information on there when we're ready to launch it. But it's going to be a while because we are kind of testing it and iterating it over the next 8 to 10 months.
Yeah. And that comes from Sonia, who's from a workforce planning board that's also doing some care related data collection. So I'm sure there's some synergies there.
Yes.
And then another question, thanks for this conversation. For sectors serving equity-seeking communities still deprioritized for disaggregated data collection, what are some ideas for cross-sectoral solutions to close data gaps that can inform policy solutions? I work in the disability sector and there remains a dearth of practical data in both government and nonprofit databases. Yeah, I agree. But happy to put that to the table if anyone wants to sort of answer, or I can jump in and start us off. Yes, doing the disaggregated data work has been really interesting personally for the last, I guess I've been doing like 3 to 4 years, because what we're finding is that as our response rates go down, it gets harder and harder to disaggregate the data in a meaningful way. And we're struggling with having a lot of ways to disaggregate the data and having a lengthy survey, but then you don't capture everyone. And so the extra questions you added, you can't technically use anymore. So this year, we actually wanted to dig more deeper into different types of organizations. And so we did add actually disability, like, are you disability serving led or focused organization, or are you all three? And that was like about 1% of the sample size in our survey. So I think one of the strategies really is for us to be able to get the survey out more broadly to as many different organizations and nonprofits in Ontario to have them fill them out. And for us, that means we need to make it more accessible. We need to make it shorter. We need to make it more quicker for folks to fill out. So we're able to gather from a broad group of folks still, and then disaggregate that data. And I think the other piece, like maybe the other strategy, is kind of like what Miriam was saying in terms of big idea. How do we stay connected across folks who are collecting data and doing some of that data survey work? I know we're working with NABC and sort of sharing our data with them. That's the Network for the Advancement for Black Communities, with OFIFC, which is the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centers, and trying to just share as much as that data as much as possible. But it really does depend on the response rates at the end of the day. And then the last question we have, the technical report about the survey mentions a trend about for-profit providers increasing in some nonprofit subsectors. Can you discuss this a bit more? What are some examples of for-profits getting involved in nonprofit subsectors? Is the concern mostly about potential loss of revenue, lost contracts, streams for nonprofits, and are there other concerns about for-profit actors? Love this question. Our policy priority, one of them is anti-privatization, which is why we asked this question. Over the years, we've just been hearing from folks. This is something that's increasing and they're seeing more and more for-profit actors in their subsectors. And so we wanted to measure that. So the statistic that you're actually talking about is about a quarter of our respondents this year said that they have seen an increase in for-profit actors in their subsector. Most of that like increase or the yeses to that question come from social services. So that's kind of where it's been the most prevalent. And then the second question we asked was, did you personally as an organization lose a contract, right? And I think that's what the second point of your question is about. And that was, I think under 15%, but most said that in the last year. And those are the only two questions we asked, because again, we didn't want to make the survey long. And I think there's less of a concern about loss of revenue. I mean, there is definitely those are usually social enterprises or those are government contracts that are support earned income revenue for nonprofits to deliver on unfunded things for sure. But I think the bigger question here is that we're exploring at ONN is what does it mean for the private sector to deliver on things that the public and nonprofit sector should be delivering on, and what does that compromise in terms of system building, in terms of decent work for the workers. I'm getting a we can wrap up message, and a lot of other things. So happy to talk about that. We do have an upcoming anti-privatization brief that we're going to share soon, and so some of those questions will be picked up there. With that, thank you so much. I feel like we just flew by and we could talk about this forever. Thank you, Jillian and Miriam and Jawad, for sharing space with us today. Thank you to everybody who signed on. All of our emails are online. Please feel free to connect with us if you have any other questions. Do access the survey. It's all online. You have the QR code. And please, please fill it out next year. Thank you.